Thank you, friends. And our speaker has run away, so back. Right. Patsy, would you like to do the introduction this morning as Ray's not here?
This is an unexpected honour. Jonathan is going to be talking to us. It's basically about cremation, but I'm really bad at remembering names, and he's going to be citing the work of, and Jonathan, I'm ashamed to say, are going to have to fill me in on the name of the Reverend.
No, he's not a reverend. He's a Dr. William Price, who comes from Llantrisant. Okay, so shall I kick off?
Yes, please.
Yeah, right. Well, firstly, I have to say, in view of the loss of Graham, I'm not quite sure whether this talk is either insensitive or topical, one or the other. I'm not quite sure which. But anyway, there's no particular Quaker angle to this talk, but as a religious society, we do organise funerals. And of course, looking at the demographic watching, we've all might have to think ahead to the wishes for our own funerals. And we've probably all arranged funerals for family members. And you may or may not have arranged a cremation. If you have, you might have known that you had to have extra doctor's forms and you had to pay for them, although you probably didn't notice because it's all hidden by in the funeral director's fees. But I'm just going to try and share my screen. Here we are. So, well, currently 78% of funerals in Britain are cremations, slightly more in England, slightly less in Scotland, and much less in Northern Ireland. But it's only been legal since 1902, and there hadn't been any cremations in Britain for 1,000 or 1,500 years. And it's a question how it became legal. I'm not sure how to, yes. So if you've been to a funeral in a church, it'll have been in a historic building. If you've been to a funeral in a crematorium, it'll be a 20th century building, almost certainly post-war, because immediately after the war, only 10% of funerals were cremations, and it's risen steadily since then to the current 80%. So this is about cremation was done in Britain in prehistoric times. Historic times, cremation was done in Britain, but this story is from 1874 to 1902. 1874 is the formation of the Cremation Society of Great Britain. 1902 is when it was finally legalised. And the key player in all this was a chap called William Price of Llantrisant. Now, you probably haven't been to Llantrisant, any of you. And you might wonder how I know about all this, and the simple answer is that Llantrisant is where my wife comes from. So I'm not sure if I can point on this thing, but well, never mind. We call him William Price of Llantrisant, although he spent most of his working life in Pontypridd, which I've marked on the map, but he retired to Llantrisant, which is where he did what he did. You see, Llantrisant sits at the edge of the coastal plain, just at the entrance to the valleys. So if you're driving from Cardiff up to the Rhondda Valleys, you'll drive up towards Llantrisant, you'll see Llantrisant Church facing you on the top of the hill. And it's a very historic place, actually. Llantrisant means the Church of the Three Saints. They're three Celtic saints. You probably haven't heard of any of them, and you certainly can't pronounce their names, so I'm not going to say. Llantrisant is actually a very historic place. It had its royal charter in 1346, but not much has happened since then in Lantricent. The old town on the top of the hill is pretty drab and run down, it has to be said. And it's not got an awful lot going for it, and that's why it's not on the tourist trail. In the coast, in the flat land underneath the hill, there is new housing, there's a retail park, and there's some industry. And the big industry there is the Royal Mint, which moved there from London some years ago. And so Lantricent has the unfortunate name of the hole with the mint. So the other thing I want to say is that cremation is nothing new worldwide. I mean, you find it all over the world in various cultures, in various times, although Jews and Muslims don't go in for it. But no cremations were happened in Britain between about 300 AD and 1880. And why is that? Well, sorry, let's go. This is a brief, very brief run through prehistory, and I hope none of you are archaeologists, because you'll probably say I got it all wrong. But we start with the Neolithic people. These are Neolithic people are people who'd learnt to do farming, and so they lived in settled communities. And they are the people who built the sort of stone circles that you can find dotted about. And what they did with their dead was called excarnation, where they, I think they left the bodies out to be sort of picked clean by animals. And then they collected up the bones and put them in these communal tombs. And the bones are all sort of mixed up, you know, that when the archaeologists have gone into these long barrows, as I said, the bones are all jumbled up there. Presumably, the Neolithic people had some sort of system. I don't know, but it was certainly a communal thing. And then we come to the Beaker people. So the Beaker people came from Europe. There's some debate among archaeologists whether it was a big mass migration or whether it was just the ideas came. And more than just bringing a different shaped pots, they also brought metalworking with them. That is the ability to make bronze. And there was a complete change of funerals at that time, that now burials were individual. A burial was for one person in an individual grave and accompanied with grave goods to help, presumably to help people into the afterlife. Or sometimes people were cremated and the ashes were put in pots and put in these individual graves. So then we go to the next phase when the Iron Age people came. These are the ancestors of the Celts, and they did more or less the same. So these are the round barrows that you see, as opposed to the long barrows like the West Kennet long barrow in near Avebury, which is one of the more famous ones. And then we had the Roman invasion, and the Romans also did a mixture of burial and cremation. But during the time of the Roman occupation, cremation became less common and burial more so. And the reason for that was the adoption of Christianity, because Christ, of course, was resurrected after he'd been put in the tomb. And there's the feeling that at the last judgment, we will be resurrected and we'll need our physical bodies. Although it doesn't actually say that in the Bible, to be honest. I can't say, I don't want to get into a big theological argument, but resurrection is clearly a central tenet of Christianity. And the Nicene Creed which is adopted by the Church of England, ends up with "I look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come." From the Old Testament, actually, we have this text: "I know that my Redeemer liveth, and he shall stand at the latter day. And though the worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God." That comes from the book of Job. If you haven't read the book of Job just recently, you might recognize it as one of the arias from Handel's Messiah. And that does sort of imply that maybe you don't need the physical body because the worms are destroyed. And then if you go on to the order for the burial of the dead from the Anglican prayer book, it ends up, we commit the body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life. Not dust to dust comes from the book of Genesis, when God kicks Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. He says, "Out of dust you came, and to dust you shall return." The ashes to ashes bit, I don't know how that crept in, because that the ashes to ashes bit doesn't actually seem to be in the Bible, as far as I know. Certainly not in the book of Genesis. But there was, whatever the theology of this, it was, a lot of people felt that you needed a physical body to be resurrected. And this is the day of the Last Judgment, painting from around the 1500, and you can see at the Last Judgment people are climbing up out of their tombs and into a happier state. And even in the 20th century, was an artist called Stanley Spencer, who lived in Cookham in Berkshire. And this is Cookham, his picture of Cookham churchyard with a lot of these people are his friends, actually, the faces of those of his friends popping up out of their tombs. He was a devout Christian. This is another of his triptych altarpieces. But in the 1800s, there came some renewed interest in cremation. 1822 was a bit of an accident, actually. The poet Shelley drowned in a storm at sea in Italy, and after a day or two, his body was washed up on the beach, and his friends didn't quite know what to do. But in a sort of romantic throwback to Italian or Roman or Greek times, they actually cremated him on the beach, except they didn't do it very well. But in the 1870s, there was interest in cremation in Italy, and there's a Professor Ponzi, I think his name was, who actually developed a suitable apparatus for cremating humans. And in the 1873 Vienna exhibition, a model of this apparatus was displayed, along with a sample of ashes. And it happened to be seen by this chap, Sir Henry Thompson, who was Queen Victoria's surgeon. So what were the arguments for cremation? Well, firstly, because of the Industrial Revolution, towns and cities were growing and the graveyards weren't big enough, and there was a big problem of space. Secondly, there was this, you might have heard of the miasma theory, where that diseases were spread by the smells that came from rotting material. That was being challenged at that time, and there were people having a more modern view of it, but it was still reasonably present. And so they thought, well, if you're burying all these bodies, you've got this miasma coming out, and that's going to spread diseases. And there's also, with more scientific knowledge, Darwin and such like, people had perhaps a more nuanced idea of what resurrection meant, that it was a spiritual thing rather than a physical thing, and there was perhaps less need to preserve the physical corpse. Here are some of the other arguments. So some people said this was a sanitary necessity because burying bodies was spreading diseases. There was a dispute about that at the time. Other people said it was fine. And actually it isn't true. If you bury a body properly, it doesn't spread diseases. In the early 1800s, of course, people were worried about having graves desecrated because people used to dig up bodies to sell to the medical schools for teaching of anatomy. But that had declined after the passing of the Anatomy Act of 1832, which gave a more legal route for medical schools to get bodies. Next argument was that ashes make good fertilizer. That's actually not true, because what we call the ashes from cremation aren't sort of ashes in the same way as your ashes from a garden bonfire or anything. They've got no organic material in them. It's basically just the minerals from the bones, which is basically calcium phosphate and a few other trace elements. So the phosphate might be good, but there's no nitrogen, there's no potassium in it, I don't think. Some people said it might be cheaper. That may or may not be true. I think probably works out about the same. And another serious argument was less standing about in the rain, and that is certainly true, I suppose. Although when I've been to a lot of crematoriums for funerals, we often do have to stand about outside waiting for it to start. So. And then, of course, there were objections to cremation that, the more traditional Christians said it wasn't Christian. Worry that it might hide murder, and that there was actually no legal basis for this. So, right, let's see if we can. Oops. So, in 1874, this Henry Thompson, who'd seen the cremation apparatus displayed in Vienna, he founded the Cremation Society, and it had lots of prominent members from arts, science, literature, and medicine, although the church didn't approve of this. Most of the members were well known at the time. We probably wouldn't recognize many of them. You might know the artist Millet, Trollope, of course, the author Tenniel, artist who illustrated Alice in Wonderland. And the doctors would know the name of Spencer Wells, who was another surgeon of the time. And they got some money and they built a crematorium in Woking. They had a bit of trouble finding the land because they started off in one corner of one churchyard, but then the bishop said, no, this is consecrated ground, you can't build it here. But they eventually found some non-consecrated ground in Woking, which happened to have a railway station nearby, which was handy if people wanted to travel there. And so they built it. But the good citizens of Woking weren't having any of it and said, we don't want a crematorium here. And they appealed to the Home Secretary, and the Home Secretary said, well, there's no legal approval for this, so you can't use it. And so they wasted their money, actually. Here's a contemporary picture of Woking Crematorium, nice landscape gardens, you can see. There was a brief exception. In 1882, a certain Captain Hannam, his mother and wife had died quite close together, and they had wished to be cremated. So he went to Woking and said, can you do it? And they said, well, sorry, no, the Home Secretary says no. So, but fortunately for Captain Hannam, he had a nice big country estate, so he got it done, organised it on his own estate. And the following year after he died, he was cremated there. But although it wasn't clear that this was legal, the Home Office didn't take any action, but nobody else tried. So we're still in this sort of limbo where nobody quite knows whether cremation is legal or not. And so basically the Cremation Society had failed in their objective, even though their committee was full of the great and the good of Britain. But there was this fellow, William Price, who was an eccentric local doctor from the Welsh Valleys, and basically single-handedly he got it legalized. So who was William Price? There's a portrait of him, aged 22. He's quite a handsome young man there. But I'm just going to stop screen sharing for a minute. Well, William Price's life, you couldn't make it up if you tried, really. And I've got a copy of a biography of his here, which goes into it in quite a lot of detail. But he was born in 1800 and he died in 1890s, I think. So his life spanned virtually the whole of the 1800s. When he was born, Wales was just emerging from an agricultural society. By the time he died, Wales was the powerhouse of British industry, producing coal and iron and steel. His father was an ordained Anglican priest and Oxford educated, but he was eccentric and eventually went mad. And so he never had a proper Church of England living. And so he was quite poor. And William Price's mother was an illiterate maidservant. And it was a bit of a scandal that his father, this pillar of society as a priest, should marry so low below his station. But anyway, he did. William Price spoke only Welsh until the age of 10. But he overcame poverty to study medicine and become a doctor. I think he managed to get somebody to sponsor him to become apprenticed to an apothecary, which was one of the ways in those days you could become a doctor. And he was duly apprenticed to an apothecary, served some time there. And then he moved to London, where he studied at St Bartholomew's Hospital, where he studied surgery there. So that eventually he passed his exams for the apothecaries, became a licentiate of the Society of Apothecaries, and passed the exams to be a member of the Royal College of Surgeons. So that's how in those days you could become a doctor. Actually, you could become a doctor in that way when I qualified, although by the time I qualified, most people had a university degree as well, but you didn't actually need one in the 1970s. So let's go. But he found he could have been a sort of physician in London, but he could never become a member of the College of Physicians because they were very the College of Physicians were very protective of themselves, and if you hadn't been to Oxford or Cambridge, you wouldn't get in. So he came back to Wales basically as a general practitioner, although of course in those days GPs, doctors, did surgery. So it's reported that he did a bone graft on an injured worker. He did a cesarean section on a kitchen table for somebody. So more than I could have done. So we'll just go back to screen sharing, if I may. Where are we? And I need to go. Right, so And he was apparently a very good doctor. I mean, he's highly respected and much sought after by a lot of people. He must have been a very good diagnostician. Of course, he wouldn't have had the treatments available that we have today, but anyway, his opinion was well thought of. He was a Chartist. If you remember, the Chartists were a left-wing organisation. And his Chartism was also fueled by his Welsh nationalism, because he saw that the workers in Wales were working for low wages, which enriched the industrialists who are all English. So he saw this not only as a socialist thing, but as an attack on the Welsh. He was a vegetarian, and he was also against smoking, which of course was very rife. And he always seemed to be in court, either suing somebody or being sued, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But he always represented himself. He didn't employ any lawyers. And as a successful doctor, he was reasonably comfortably off. What's the next slide? Yes. So he was those things. He was also a Welsh nationalist. He was himself eccentric. Probably many ordinary people would regard him as mad as a hatter, but he did have some grip on reality, more than his father had. And he was a self-appointed arch-druid. Just going back to his doctoring, he was appointed as the works doctor to the Brown and Lennox chain works in 28Apr2023, which was a big organisation, and they made huge chains. They had another chain factory in Millwall in London, and they made anchor, among other things, they made anchor chains for big ships. And right up to the 1960s, they made the anchor chain for the Queen Elizabeth II. So this was a big industrial undertaking. Sadly, nowadays, the chain works is occupied by a B&Q and Sainsbury's and such like. But he was voted in by the workforce to be the works doctor. And the system then was, there was no NHS, of course, that the employer deducted a small contribution from the wages of all the workers, and that was used as a fund to pay the doctor's fees. And that was quite a widespread practice among industries in South Wales and probably elsewhere in Britain, as far as and sometimes it worked well because some of the more enlightened employers would chip in some money of their own. The less scrupulous employers would take the money and keep some of it for themselves and not bother to pay the doctors. And the biggest and best of these schemes was the that run for the Tredegar Iron and Steel Works, which continued right into the 20th century. And it was very comprehensive, and it also covered the families of the workers and local residents who could join if they contributed a fee. And in the mid-20th century, the union official who was on the board of the medical fund there was somebody called Aneurin Bevan, who of course became Minister of Health in the post-war Labour government. And the NHS was basically modelled on the Tredegar Medical Society. There are some slight differences, but the parallels are much more striking than the differences. Anyway, that's a bit of a diversion. So right, so here's William Price. But he was into Druidism as well. He wasn't the only one. There were lots of other people in Wales interested in the Druidic legends. and they built stone circles and things to do their druidic rituals at. And needless to say, there was infighting as to who was the real archdruid. It had a lot of links with the Welsh nationalism. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Blue Books of 1847. I think it's 18, I might have got the date wrong there. But that was a British government survey of Wales, which basically said that the Welsh were all idle, drunk, and they'd be better off if they were more Christian and learned to speak English. And that's always been felt as a big slur on the Welsh nation, actually, and people may still remember that today. The more Welsh nationalists. Anyway, Price was a Chartist, and you may note in 1839 there were big riots, Chartist riots in Newport. He was a leader of a lot of rallies, but he ducked out, well, rather sensibly ducked out of the Newport demonstration because I think he realized it was badly organized, and the idea was people were going to come from all directions, from both from England and other parts of Wales, and they were going to have a big riot. But of course, the organization was rubbish and all got put down by the soldiers. And he, after the Newport riots, because they knew he was the leader, the authorities had a warrant for his arrest, but he disguised himself as a woman and managed to escape to France. And after a few years, he came back, and then he had another spell in France after he had to escape again after failing a civil case. Anyway, but when he was in France, he went to the Louvre and he saw a Greek stone inscribed with the picture of the primitive bard addressing the moon. And it had these hieroglyphs on it, which he said he could translate. And he said he was the only one who could translate it. Of course, complete rubbish. But anyway, but he believed that these hieroglyphs said that he, William, was descended from the primitive bards of 2,000 years ago, and that his son would restore Druidic rule to Wales. So that was a good prophecy. The only problem was he didn't have a son, actually. But anyway, but he worked on that, and we'll just go through his family. Right, well, here's a picture of William Price in his Druidic costume. We used to go around in these robes when he wasn't doing his doctoring. So he didn't actually believe in marriage because he thought it enslaved women, but that didn't stop him having extramarital relations and having some illegitimate children, and I don't quite know what happened there. But anyway, his first marriage, because he married with a Druidic ceremony to Anne Morgan, they had this daughter who he called something like Gwen Hyaelin Iachles Morganig, which means Gwen, Countess of Glamorgan, which of course she wasn't. It was a rather presumptive title, but it's nothing to what he called his son later. Anyway, and then in 1881, now he needed a son, he actually came across this lady, Gwenllian Llewellyn, who was in her 20s, so she was 60 years younger than him, but she was into Druidism as well. And when Price was 83, they had a son. That was his first son. And they later went on to have another son and a daughter. And his daughter, who was called Penelope, later became a nurse and a musician and a little bit of a minor celebrity in Llantrisant. And she was walking around Llantrisant. I never saw her, but she was walking around Llantrisant at the time when I first met my wife. And I'd said to my in-laws, "Do you know this Penelope?" And, yeah, we see her around sometimes. I mean, they weren't friends with her, but they knew who she was. And I think it's quite remarkable that I could have been walking around the same town as the daughter of a Chartist, right from the 1830s. Anyway, So in 1883, he had his son, and he called him Jewkes, which means Jesus Christ, which is, again, rather presumptive and especially odd because Price had renounced Christianity in favor of Druidism. But anyway, sadly, the little boy died of a fever at the age of 5 months. And Price thought that the Druids would have cremated somebody, and he wanted his son cremated. So what happened next? So he owned some sort of farmland on a hill next to Llantrisant, and he built a funeral pyre and started to cremate the little infant. But, you know, a group of the townspeople appeared, and they weren't at all happy with this. They said this was desecration of the dead, possibly had Price murdered him. And of course, they knew Price was a bit mad with his druidic beliefs and wondered if it was even a human sacrifice. So the body was pulled from the fire, hadn't really got burnt by that point. And the crowd wanted to throw Price onto the funeral pyre instead. But fortunately, there was a policeman there who was well practiced in sorting out minors' brawls in the pubs on a Friday night. So he saved Price from that, but then arrested him and jailed him, and he impounded the child's body. So what happened next? Well, the child hadn't been baptized, which of course was a bit of a social scandal, but the birth hadn't been registered either, which was actually illegal. And the mother, Gwenllian, was fined £2, which was about a month's wages for a workman at the time, so not an insignificant sum. But also, there'd been no death certificate. And so the police had informed the coroner, and the coroner said, well, unless somebody produces a proper death certificate, I'm going to have an inquest on Monday. This was on Friday or Saturday. But Price just actually started the cremation on the Sunday until it was interrupted. And as I said, the police impounded the body, and a day or two later, they got some other doctors to do a post-mortem, and they found that the boy had died of natural causes. They interviewed, Price gave a history of how he'd been sickly and had a fever, and the mother corroborated this. But Price had been arrested, and he was charged in the local magistrates' court for indignities to the body, public nuisance, failure to give a Christian burial. Didn't know actually there was a law to say you had to have Christian burial, but anyway, that was the charge. And the magistrate was quite unsympathetic and sent him to Cardiff Assizes. So off he went with the Cardiff Assizes, and the other cases that were on that day was somebody who was accused of stealing some knives and some other minor things, but Price was the star attraction, and the judge was more sympathetic. The Assizes judge was more sympathetic than the magistrate. So the first charge was that he'd attempted to dispose of a body to avoid an inquest, but actually the argument was that there'd be no reason to think that the death was unnatural, and therefore there would have been no reason for the coroner to demand an inquest. He'd only asked for one after this cremation business. So the jury found him not guilty on that charge of avoiding an inquest. So that was that. Then they come to the second charge, which is cremating a body in violation of public decency and against common law. Well, the judge thought about it a lot and looked up his legal books and said there'd never been a legal decision about cremation. And although there wasn't a law allowing cremation, there was no law forbidding it. And so case was dismissed. It had to go, the jury had to agree to that. And Price spoke very eloquently. He could speak very eloquently when he wanted to. So 3 months later, after all this legal stuff, the little boy was cremated on the hilltop. This time the crowd watched from the foot of the hill, but didn't intervene. Now, as I said, Price was highly eccentric, and most people would have regarded him as mad, but he had a sufficient grip on reality to have some bronze commemorative medals made, sold for £3 each, so that would have made him £37, which would have been 40 weeks average wages for a workman. And then he sued the police for imprisonment, and he actually won the case, but he only got 1 farthing of damages. And not many years later, 9 years later, Price himself died at the age of 93 and was cremated in front of a crowd of 20,000 people. That's a picture of him being cremated on this hilltop. The police were there, but there wasn't any trouble. People watched reasonably respectively. Yeah. So what is Price's legacy? Well, during his trial, he'd had thousands of letters of support. The British Medical Journal welcomed the decision, the legal decision. And almost straight away afterwards, the Cremation Societies got the Cremation Bill introduced into Parliament, although it was opposed by both the government and the opposition. But they were surprised that they got 79 votes in favour. It was rejected, but the number of votes in favour was much more than they'd expected. Then the Cremation Society said, well, the judgment in Price's case was it wasn't actually illegal. So they started using they said, okay, our crematorium in Woking is open for business. They did realise that they needed to have rules and regulations to avoid concealment of death. So they set some rules down. And these are very largely what it's still in use today, as second doctor opinions and such like. And fairly soon afterwards, other people opened private crematoria in Glasgow, in these towns. And in 1901, actually, the municipal authorities in Hull opened the first one, the first municipal one. And in 1902 was the official passing of the Cremation Act, which allows burial authorities to establish crematoria. The Secretary of State can make regulations about how they're operated and prescribe the various forms of certificate. And this is still the act that's in force today. The regulations and certificates have been updated, particularly in 2009. But ironically, what Dr. Price did is actually now illegal, because the Cremation Act says cremations can only be done in licensed crematoria and not on anybody's hillside. So if you go to Llantrisant, you'll see the statue of Dr. Price. This is a photo of the unveiling of the statue in 1970-something. Here he is standing in what's called the Bull Ring, which is really the town square in Llantrisant. He's got a druidic half-moon symbol in one hand, and he's got a torch in the other hand. It's quite a big statue. You see, it's quite a lot bigger than I am. That's me. And if you look at the back of it, I'm standing at the back of it now, that photo, and where he stands in the Bull Ring, he's looking across to this hilltop, which is where his cremation of his son took place. And I'm just going to briefly divert into some local history. you're all familiar with Arnesvale Cemetery, perhaps. And, like Highgate Cemetery and others, there were these fashionable private cemeteries. And Arnesvale was established in 1839. But by the 1920s, it was going out of fashion, and it was in a bit of financial trouble. And then they said, this cremation thing, that sounds a good thing. So they started offering cremations, and that was the financial salvation of Arnesvale for 50 or something years. And they were the first crematorium in the southwest. And at one time, they had 5 cremation furnaces. We didn't get other crematoria here. Canford in the 1950s, Bristol South Crematorium in the 1970s. But then Arnesvale in about 1998, their crematorium no longer met the environmental requirements, and it was closed down, and then Arnesvale was financially unviable, and as you know, it went to rack and ruin until after a lot of argument, Bristol City Council bought it, and it's now run by a charity. It's leased to a charity who look after it. And if you go to Arnesvale, I don't know how many of you been to Arnesvale Cemetery, but if you're nonconformist, in the nonconformist chapel, there's a little cafe and some but if you go down into the basement, there's an exhibition about cremation, and you can see one of the furnaces, and if you've got a strong enough stomach for it, you can see the machine that used to grind up the bones into the powder that we call the ashes. Not to everybody's taste, perhaps. I don't know if anyone wants any questions, or whether quickly to talk about the pros and cons of burial versus cremation. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I've got a comment really.
Yeah.
My mum died in 2014.
Yes.
Mum and Dad always lived in very rural Kent, Romney Marsh.
Yes.
And when she died, she had said she'd written a will saying she wanted cremation because rural Kent is very traditional.
Yeah.
And I also remember me at one point she wanted her ashes scattered in the sea. So I reminded my brother of that, and he said, well, if you organize it, you know, I'll come, but I'll have nothing to do with the organization. So I went down to Folkestone and I found a boat, and apparently it's quite common in Folkestone for people to want their ashes scattered in the sea, but it has to be well out of the way of the harbour. There's laws about it. So I got a boat that was prepared to do it. My sister was over from Canada, and my 2 daughters and one of my granddaughters I think all 3 of my oldest grandchildren were there. My granddaughter Anna was doing photography A-level, so it was going to be photographed. And we went right out, well out, and ashes. My brother sensibly had he took some of the ashes because his idea was that we would bury the ashes in Charing Crematorium. We bought a cherry tree, their mum and dad's favourite fruit, and some of mum's ashes were scattered with dad's. And I have to say, they were married 60-something years, and it was guerrilla warfare between my parents for most of the time. Don't get the idea. So that we laughed, thinking that no matter what, Mum and Dad's ashes were together forever and ever.
Like it or not.
Like it or not. Yeah, you know, so that's my little anecdote about what happens to the ashes.
Yeah, well, of course, what you do with ashes is a bit of an issue. You, you may know about the effect of scattering ashes winds there, because they're very acidic, and they're not actually, I'm not sure whether they're particularly good for cherry trees, but they're certainly not good for the plants on Snowdon. So Mary's asking something.
Just to say that the Royal Navy in Plymouth will, free of charge, take ashes out to sea, as does the RNLI. But also, I'd just like to, if we could talk about the environmental impact.
Yeah.
You've got extremely powerful furnaces for a start.
Yes.
And I'm not sure how sort of pure the ashes are when they're scattered or left in the ground.
Well, okay, there's two things there. I mean, firstly, the ashes are basically calcium phosphate, and they're quite inert. They've got no germs, no viruses in them. I'm just going back to my screen sharing, if I can. Oh. I mean, the environmental cost is very difficult to work out, because people have done studies on this, but it all depends on what your burial practices are, and some of the studies have been done in America, where things are quite different than in Britain, because in America, if you're buried, they put a concrete lining to where you're buried, which of course has a huge carbon cost. You've got the embedded carbon cost of actually constructing the crematorium. With the burial, you've got the ongoing carbon cost of maintaining the burial ground for years to come. Cremation, as you said, that uses a lot of gas at the time with a lot of CO2. But a burial, as the body decomposes, it releases methane, which, as you know, is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. Cremation does release mercury vapor from your tooth fillings, but that can be removed by filters on the, and crematoria do have filters to remove the mercury vapor. In America, of course, they use a lot of embalming fluid, which is certainly not good for the environment, but we tend not to use that in Britain. As for the actual carbon cost, cremation, most crematoria are gas-fired, and normally it produces about 150 or 200 kilograms of carbon dioxide. Now, in Britain, the average carbon footprint of somebody is 10 tons a year, which is 27 kilos a day. So cremation uses up about 6 days worth of your carbon footprint. If you're very green and you stick to what the climate scientists say is our necessary carbon footprint to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, you should have only use 2 tons of carbon a year, which is 5.5 kilograms a day, which is a month's. So a cremation uses a month's worth of that minimal carbon footprint. So if you want to keep your carbon footprint down, all you've got to do is die a month earlier than you plan to. I mean, it is actually a very small part of your lifetime carbon footprint. Other things you can do, of course, if you buried shallowly, normally bodies are buried 6 feet down where there's no oxygen, and so you get the anaerobic decomposition, which releases the methane. But if you're buried close to the surface in reasonably lively soil, reasonably active soil, you don't get aerobic decomposition. There's no methane, and the nutrients go back into the topsoil. The law says you have to have 2 feet, normally 3 feet of earth on top of the coffin, but you are allowed 2 feet if the soil is active and lively. So that is allowed. There is this process which has been developed in Sweden, where the body is sort of freeze-dried and then sort of granulated, and then you can put that in soil and it will decompose even more rapidly. I mean, the problem with shallow burial is if it's too shallow, you've got 2 problems. Firstly is possibility of smell, and secondly is whether the animals will dig you up. But 2 feet down is enough. And then there's this other process called alkaline hydrolysis, which basically means putting the body in a bath of potassium hydroxide, I think, and applying heat and pressure. And it actually uses much less energy than a powdered, the calcium phosphate powder, and a sort of lot of nutrient-rich fluid, which is normally in other countries just put into the wastewater system. The water companies sort of don't like it. And
a tiny bit of Dad's.
sorry? I can't say it appeals to me, because if you have cremation, at least you have some ashes to deal with. If you have this resumation thing, you basically end up with litres and litres of what's essentially baby bio, I think, and it doesn't seem somehow quite the same. But I suppose my distaste for that is probably the same as the distaste the Welsh had in Llantrisant in 1884. So anyway, that's the carbon side of things.
They're over time, but we can still have another question of perhaps one more. Anybody?
Really?
Just a comment to say it's an incredible amount of information, really interesting, and I'm quite surprised, and I feel much better informed and interesting. One thing that when in the Eastern wisdom systems, they talk about there being a subtle body and causal body as well as a physical body, so you can have the loss of this outer sheath doesn't not required at a resurrection, and equally that subtler body is involved in transmigration, as it were, from one life to a next. That's how that mechanism works. And there's a lot of research come out in recent years about near-death experiences indicating persistence of something when the physical body is genuinely dead, if only for a few moments. So, but that's another topic. I don't want to get into mysticism. The practicalities of what you've talked about is absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Well, I didn't include bits of St. Paul from Corinthians, which talks about putting off the physical body and taking on something immortal. Though yes, you can find some of it there. There's also in the Messiah, in Handel's Messiah, actually, the body must put off corruption and take on incorruption or something. I can't remember the phrase. Yeah, Kathy?
Yeah, I just want to say, one of my memories from the time of COVID was when in India they were having lots and lots of deaths.
Yeah.
All the 20 or 30 funeral pyres on all at once.
Yes.
No, that was interesting. I know the climate's different there, which means they can just do it with firewood, I suppose. But
well, I think traditionally they do. Yeah.
Oh, that was interesting. Anyway.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, yes, because of course the Hindus go in for it in a big way, but I said the Jews and the Muslims definitely do not. And the Roman Catholics only allowed it in since about 1960 or something. And they stipulate that the ashes should be put into consecrated ground. Not put in the sea like Angela's. That would be most un-Catholic.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. I mean, as David said, we've learned such a lot today. Really, really interesting. And yeah, I'm no nearer to deciding whether cremation or is going to thought. Okay.
Well, if you're worried about the carbon, it's about equal either way. So, yes.
Decide on other grounds.
Sorry?
Decide on other grounds than.
Oh, no, yes, quite, yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Okay.
We have actually Gordon is with us today, and Gordon is going to be giving us a talk next week, I believe. Gordon.
Sorry, what was your question? My deafness doesn't help. Yes.
Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, I've got it was to do with conscription, wasn't it? You're going to talk about.
Yes, odd thing for a Quaker group to be looking at, but somebody actually raised in that week ago, and it reminded me of my experience, and that there is a lot to have been said for it, and I think we've lost certain things. I'm not suggesting we go back to it, but I'll bring it out next week. I don't think I've got enough to talk for an hour, and my sort of complete incompetence means that if there's anything elaborate needed in the way of changing the format of what we've got here, I'm pretty basic, and that's all I can do to actually see anybody, never mind anyway, we'll try.
It's much appreciated, and just a short talk, and then which could then open up discussion.
Yes, that's all I can think of. Yes.
All right. Thanks very much, everybody. David, what do we have to do to close?
You just click leave at the bottom right, and that kind of, and then we're done.
Okay. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.